expenses rates for employees travelling outside the UK. Thank you. Can I just say, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir Chope. I'm bringing this motion before the House this afternoon to call on the Government to ensure that serious consideration is given to reassessing the scale rates for expenses and subsidence which is paid to employees who, by nature of their work, are required to travel outside of the UK. Crawley is my constituency. It's home to Gatwick Airport, and as a result, it is also home to many workers, including pilots and various members of cabin crew, who are often required to spend a considerable amount of time abroad with the flights that they are crewing. This can last anywhere from several hours to, for those working particularly long-haul flights, several days. Time is spent away from home in foreign cities without access to kitchens or other domestic utilities, and it can be overwhelmingly expensive, particularly for junior members of the cabin crew, whose salaries, according to the National Careers Service, begin at around £19,000. It is right, therefore, that employers pay tax-deductible subsidence payments to their employees to cover the costs associated with travel necessary to do their jobs. Under the previous government, in order to save companies from checking every single receipt that an employee accrues while abroad, HMRC introduced a benchmark expenses rate for employees travelling outside of the UK. These were first published on the government's website in 2013 with unique rates produced for almost every one of the world's major cities, setting out the average cost of drinks, of breakfast, lunch and dinner, of a night in a hotel room, and even the journey from hotel to office. Each city had also been given broader, non-specific subsistence reimbursement rates demarcated across specific time boundaries. This is a rate for when employees spent over 5 hours in a given city, and another for when they spent over 10 and 24 hours there. The detail with which the task of producing these rates for over a decade ago is evident, not simply by the fact that HMRC went to the effort of going city by city and making unique assessments, but that the increase in reimbursement between 5, 10 and 24 hours is not only non-linear, it is also unique between cities. However, and despite the time and effort which have clearly already been put into producing these bespoke rates, they have only been significantly upgraded once in the last 13 years. That was in October 2014, just a year after they were first produced, and only included a fraction of the cities listed. Despite receiving previous assurances on this topic that the government keeps all taxes, including overseas subsistence rates, under review, if you check their website, the rates payable to an employee who's travelled to Zagreb for work are listed in Croatian kuna, despite the fact that Croatia joined the euro on the 1st of January in 2023. The subsistence rates for at least 15 European capitals, including Athens, Madrid, Lisbon and Dublin, have never received an update. That means, due to over a decade of inflation, these benchmark values have been eroded in real terms. Ahead of this debate, using the total residual rates produced in 2013 and nation-specific consumer price index inflation figures from the World Bank Group, we've calculated that we might have expected the subsistence rates for European destinations to be today. Amsterdam's total residual rate in 2013 was set at €71. A year later, it was raised to €72, where it remains today. According to the World Bank's data, prices in the Netherlands 12 years since have risen at an average of 2.6% every year, which compounds to a 36% increase over this period. Had the 2013 rate for Amsterdam increased in line with inflation, workers having to spend over 24 hours in the city would now receive over €96. Here, the fact that these rates have been ignored for so long means that cabin crew and pilots, my constituents and constituents of adjacent areas, are losing out on subsistence payments of more than €25. Of course.
And I represent Horsham, an adjacent constituency, and I've very much experienced the same problem. So this is not a rare thing. I have many cabin crew in my area saying the same thing. I also have one person who is affected, trying to get leave to remain, and the visa application is extremely complicated by going back and forth out of the country. So I very much support him, and I would like to emphasise to the Minister that this is not a small problem.
Thank you. And I take that fully on board, and I'm delighted to have you here today for this debate. There are cities in Europe where the situation is even more pronounced than in Amsterdam. In Budapest, the total residual rate set in 2013 and unchanged since 2014 has been eaten away by a compound inflation rate of 67% in Hungary. The current payment of 16,000 forint is well over 10,000 forints, or 40% lower than it should be. The worst of this amongst European capitals, however, is Ankara. In the years since the overseas subsistence rates were first set, Turkey has experienced huge inflation. Prices have risen at an average of 22.5% every year. Despite this, Ankara's total residual rate remains at the 240 lira rate as set in 2014. If this is increased with inflation, it would be over 2,500 lira today, which represents an unrealised tenfold increase. In these situations, as a direct result of the Treasury not having revisited those rates over the last 12 years, airlines and other organisations are able to justify undercompensating their staff by pointing out to what is essentially government guidance. When I wrote to the Treasury with these concerns last year, the Exchequer Secretary informed me that in these situations, where the expenses rates do not cover the actual costs of needing to eat and drink and sleep while abroad for work, the employers can instead choose to pay actual expenses incurred. Unfortunately, not every company chooses to do that for their employees, with very many of them instead choosing, and I don't think it should be a surprise for any of us that this is the case, to pay the lower rate, the government's fixed rate. This is an issue having a real and detrimental impact on the working lives of cabin crew. A constituent of mine working for an airline operating out of Gatwick Airport was blunt about this, telling me that the fact that these rates are so far behind reality means that they've been forced to miss meals while abroad for work. Another constituent stated that the current scale rate allowances do not reflect the real costs we face on these trips, and reiterated that the allowance provided does not even cover the most basic meals. It's evident, therefore, that overseas rates must be raised. This is why I was delighted when, in his written statement, my honourable friend, the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, committed to reviewing and uprating them last month. This has been a long time coming. While simply increasing the 2013 rates in line with inflation would be welcome, I hope the Treasury takes some time to understand a full review of how subsistence rates can be systematically improved. Having secured this debate, I was contacted by Virgin Atlantic, who, amongst other things, raised concerns that there are some destinations where the current rates might not reflect the full cost of subsistence for an individual visiting or living in the city. For instance, they provide the example of Lagos, where safety restrictions require pilots and cabin crew to remain within their hotels and rely on higher cost room service or on-site dining. It is their view, and the view that I share, that any review should give consideration to these concerns and ensure that safe accommodation is made affordable under the new rates. I am well aware that questions related to tax pose difficult decisions for governments to make, particularly at times of global economic uncertainty such as these. But I would hope that we'd all accept that people shouldn't be going without meals while undertaking travel essential to their work, particularly where those individuals may already be on a very low wage. I'll be closely following the outcome of the Treasury's review into overseas scale rates and hope that the various issues that I've highlighted here today are reflected in its outcome. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered expenses rates for employees travelling outside the UK. Minister.
It is a pleasure to speak in this debate with you in the chair, Sir Christopher, and I thank my honourable friend, the member for Crawley, for raising this important issue today and for the work that he and neighbouring MPs on a cross-party basis have been doing to highlight this important issue and the concerns that their constituents have raised with them as members of Parliament. I was just checking, I can see hundreds of people in the Crawley constituency have signed the petition, similarly in Horsham and others nearby, people signing the petition near Heathrow and other major airports. This is clearly an issue that affects many staff who work in the airline industry and, as my honourable friend points out, particularly affects those who are on lower wages and who, will find yes, they may really enjoy and love the travel and going to visit so many different places as part of their work and the big benefits that come from a job working in the sky and working for airlines. But there are costs that are associated with being away from home, and it's right that the overseas scale rate system was put in place in 2014, but it is not right at all that it hasn't been updated since then. These overseas scale rates, or OSRs, play an important role in reducing administrative burdens when employees incur these subsistence costs while travelling overseas. And the key thing is that they provide a practical alternative to reimbursing and evidencing every single expense, which would be a significant burden if they were to be abolished at any point in the future on airlines, and a burden that we certainly want to avoid. And as my honourable friend set out, these rates have remained frozen more or less since 2014. I was doing the maths just earlier today in preparation for today's debate, and I came up with similar figures. If they'd been rated in line with inflation here in the UK, they'd have increased by 40% since 2014. Inflation rates vary, of course, across the globe, but that does give you a sense of the size of the of the gap that's opened up over the last 12 years. So the government has been listening to representations made by airlines, made by individuals, and made by members of Parliament, including my honourable friend. And we will review the overseas scale rates. We announced that just a few short weeks ago. We're going to review the OSRs and the BSRs as well, which are the domestic equivalent, the benchmark scale rates that set out the scale rates for lunches and dinners that employees may have when they're here in the UK on business. We are not just going to look at the uprating of these rates, but also to look whether there's scope to simplify the OSRs. We want to engage in detail with businesses about this, and officials in HMRC have already begun that work. It may be the case that rather than having a series, hundreds of individual rates for individual countries that need to be updated in a sort of painstaking and administratively costly way, and also difficult to administer for businesses, that having buckets or bands may work better for employers and employees. But that's something that we want to look at as part of this review, and I'd really welcome representations from the members here in Westminster Hall today on behalf of your constituents as to what sort of changes you would like to see. But let me be clear, we haven't taken any decisions on where we'd like to go. Our mind is not made up. We're convinced we want to review it and we want to make the system better, but we want to carefully consider the issues, gather evidence, hear from those who are affected before a decision is made. I was meeting with the CBI, who represent some of the large airlines, just last week, who welcomed the announcement of a review, and I look forward to receiving further representations from the private sector too. As my honourable friend points out, it's important for the government to strike the right balance between supporting businesses, maintaining fairness in the tax system, also protecting the exchequer, making sure that in the round we're raising the revenue that we need to fund the public services that we need to put right after the last 14 years where too many had been cut back. And we also need to make sure that any administrative arrangements such as these remain straightforward and proportionate. But I do hope, and of course there's political change in the air, but I do hope that this review will conclude in time for the budget, and that we won't be in a place where, in years and years to come, we're still waiting for these changes to come in. I hope that we can make swift progress in the coming months, so that your constituents, so that my honourable friends' constituents, so that employees of airlines across the country can see some improvement here. So I'm grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Crawley, for bringing the debate. Grateful for the intervention as well today. I will take the strength of feeling and the strong representation back to me, back to the department with me, for as long as I may be in the department.
The question is that this House has considered expenses rates for employees travelling outside the United Kingdom. As many of them say aye. Can't you know? I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is suspended until 4:30.